A equals A. I mean, it's the most basic self-evident truth there is, right? A thing is itself. It's so simple, you've probably never given it a second thought. But what if I told you that behind that simple equation lies a really fascinating and surprisingly complex story?
So, is it really the simplest truth out there? Or is there a whole hidden history that we just take for granted? I mean, the journey of turning the basic idea of sameness into the formal equation A equals A took literally thousands of years. Okay, let's dive in and unpack this.
So, in this explainer, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to follow the trail of this fundamental law. We'll start way back in ancient Greece, where identity was this deep, metaphysical concept, and we'll follow it all the way into our modern world, where it's become an absolutely crucial tool for logic and for science.
Our story actually begins not with mathematicians in a classroom, but with philosophers who were wrestling with the biggest questions of all, like the very nature of existence. For them, identity wasn't just some abstract rule. It was about what it truly means for something to be.
You see, long before anyone wrote it down as a formula, the law of identity was considered a supreme principle of thinking. It was this foundational truth that basically says everything at its very core is identical to itself. And this wasn't about symbols or equations, this was about reality.
And what's so cool is how these philosophical giants saw it differently. For Plato, our whole concept of equality is a priori. It's this innate idea that's already in our heads before we experience anything. It's like it's hardwired into us, and that's what lets us see sameness in the world. Aristotle, on the other hand, was way more direct. For him, true identity was just about being one in number. A thing is itself. That's it. End of story.
And this right here shows a huge shift in thinking over time. See, for Aristotle, principles like this were laws of proof. They were basic rules for demonstrating how reality itself works. It's only much, much later, in what you might call school logic, that we started thinking of them as laws of thought, as rules about the psychological process of how our minds work, a subtle but really important difference.
So, the big question is, how did this profound philosophical idea turn into the simple A equals A that we all learn in school? Well, this next part of the journey is all about that transformation from a deep principle into a formal mathematical symbol.
So let's look at how this all unfolded. For centuries, for thousands of years, identity was just this metaphysical concept. But then, we have this huge turning point in 1557. A mathematician named Robert Record invents the equals sign. And that one little symbol, two parallel lines, paved the way for the modern era, where this big idea of self-identity could finally be captured in that clean, powerful formula, A equals A.
And this property, it actually has a formal name. It's called reflexivity. It's just a simple, kind of elegant statement that everything is, well, identical to itself. This is the direct, logical translation of that ancient philosophical idea. But it's actually more than just a statement. The formula A equals A is really the endpoint of a mental process, and it's called the abstraction of individuation. I know, that's a mouthful, right? But it's just a fancy way of saying it's how our minds isolate an object and define it as a single, distinct thing, as one and the same. Now, reflexivity isn't a lone wolf here. It's actually part of a team, a trio of axioms for equality that have been around since the time of Euclid. First, you have reflexivity, our A equals A. Then you have symmetry, which just means if A equals B, then B has to equal A. And finally, transitivity. If A equals B and B equals C, then you know A has to equal C. These three together are the bedrock of equality. But here's the really crucial point. The law of identity, our A equals A, is unique. It's the leader of the pack. You can't logically prove it using the other two. It has to be its own fundamental, independent truth. It's the starting block, the axiom that makes it possible to classify anything at all.
Okay, so this brings us to the modern era. Logicians now needed an absolutely rock-solid, scientifically sound way to guarantee sameness. They couldn't have any ambiguity. They needed a definitive litmus test for identity. This process is known as the abstraction of identification. And notice that word active. This is a huge shift. Logicians started to see identity not as something we just passively find out in the world, but as something we actively create through a formal, logical process, using those three axioms as our tools.
A key figure here was the logician Gottlob Frege. His big goal was to take the phrase one and the same and make it scientifically invariant. That means he wanted it to have the exact same, crystal clear meaning whether you were doing math, physics, or philosophy. no exceptions.
And to pull this off, he reached back in time to an incredibly powerful definition from the brilliant philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful in Latin, but trust me, this one sentence holds the key to the entire modern understanding of identity.
So what does it mean? Pretty simply, the same things are one. One can be substituted for the other without loss of truth. This is called the principle of substitutivity, and it's the ultimate test. It says two things are truly, completely identical only if you can swap one for the other in any true statement, and that statement stays true.
And that, in a nutshell, is the modern criterion. If you want to claim that the morning star is identical to the evening star, that they are both the planet Venus, then every single thing that is true about the morning star must also be true about the evening star, and vice versa. There's no wiggle room.
So why does all this abstract stuff matter? Because this principle from Leibniz is the ultimate rule that makes identity totally unambiguous. It's what lets us classify things, which is foundational to almost everything in modern life. Seriously, every single time your computer recognizes a file as being that specific file, or a database pulls up the exact right record, it's all running on this very principle. And this brings us completely full circle. We started with what seemed like the simplest truth in the world, A equals A, and we've ended up with this idea that identity is actually an active creation of logic. And that leaves us with one last, really fascinating question to chew on. If we have to use these powerful logical tools just to define sameness, what does it truly mean for anything out there in the real world to actually be one and the same?